the first pieces of optional content that will become available to you as a new player comes in the form of crafting and gathering, a system which can be found in many other MMOs. However, in 14's case, it tends to be a bit more involved, with both your hand and land jobs having their own set of unique abilities that help you craft and or gather items. Because you see, this system in 14 isn't as simple as just pressing a single button to craft or gather an item. No, instead it does require a bit of thinking and some job knowledge, specifically when it comes to crafting. And so, here's everything you need to know about crafting and gathering as a new player. Starting with the simpler of the two disciplines, we have the Gatherers, for which there are three: Miner, Botanist, and Fisher, who is getting its own section because they're unique. Now, obviously, as the names imply, the main purpose of these jobs is to gather resources that will primarily be used to enable your crafting. As for how you go about actually gathering said resources, you first have to find a gathering node, which are spread throughout the various zones and can be seen by enabling your Gatherer's surveying skill, at which point the nodes will appear on your mini-map. You'll also end up receiving an ability called Lay of the Land, which will either guide you to the nearest node or the one with the highest level. Something else to note is that these nodes have static rewards, meaning that any nodes you find in a given area will have the same items, and different zones can have multiple different gathering areas. For example, this spot in Central Thanalan has mining nodes with copper ore and muddy water, but if we were to go slightly east, we'd find a separate gathering area with new mining nodes, this time containing bone chips. Which brings us to the gathering log, your best way of finding these different gathering areas, as all you need to do is search for the item you're looking for and it will tell you exactly where you need to go to find the correct nodes. But now that we've covered how to actually find the nodes, let's talk about actually gathering from them. Upon interacting with any node, you'll have an interface appear to show you all the different items that can be obtained, along with a couple different percentages. The bigger of the two is your gathering chance, which corresponds to your gathering stat and simply tells you your chance of actually successfully gathering that item. The second, smaller percentage is your gatherer's boon chance, which corresponds to your perception stat and tells you your chance of gathering one extra of whatever item you choose to collect. There's also your GP, which corresponds to your GP stat, and this is simply a resource you expend to use your different gathering abilities, which consists of things that improve your percentages, increase your yields, or even increase the amount of gathering attempts you have. Speaking of which, you can determine your gathering attempts by looking at the node's health bar, and the ability that increases your attempts can't be used if the node is at full health. The final note on nodes comes in the form of location effects. Occasionally you'll get nodes which have special effects like increased boon chance, extra attempts, or increased yields. However, you're only able to take advantage of these effects if you meet specific stat requirements, all of which is shown in the location effect box. Now, the last thing to cover with gathering nodes is timed nodes. As you get closer to any expansion's in-game gathering, you will eventually have to deal with unspoiled or legendary nodes, which can only be gathered at specific end-game times. However, unlike normal nodes, anytime these come up, you'll actually be made aware by a message appearing along with it automatically being highlighted on your minimap, given that you're using Truth of the Mountains or Forest. And again, unlike normal nodes, the gathering log won't actually tell you all that much about these nodes until you've actually gathered them. Also, in the case of legendary nodes, you'll actually have to buy an item with a special gathering currency for them to become accessible. But as a new player, that part isn't going to be all that important for now. Anyways, when it comes to dealing with these time nodes, I actually recommend looking outside the game to a website called Garland Tools. This is a database of essentially every item in the game, and for time nodes specifically, it will tell you how long until they're up, exactly where the node spawns, and you can even set a timer that will remind you when it comes up. A link to this website will be in the description. Moving on to Fisher, I'm not actually going to go into too much detail, as not only is it the most complex of the three, but it's also the least useful for new players, as unlike the other two who provide materials for a majority of your crafters, Fisher mostly supplies Culinarian, which itself is possibly the least useful crafter early on. Also, in general, Fisher is much more of an in-game gatherer, with the big draw of the job being completing the fishing log to acquire various titles, minions, and even a mount. But with that being said, let's go over the basics of Fisher. Like the other two gatherers, Fisher does have gathering areas, which come in the form of essentially every body of water in the game, all of which have different names to show which area you're actually fishing in. However, unlike the other two, Fisher doesn't get an interface to show what can be gathered. Instead, what you get is mostly RNG, with the main way of manipulating your catch being baits, as different fish will have better chances or even require certain baits. Also, not every bait can be used in every source of water, but the game will tell you when a bait can't be used. The other determining factor obviously comes in the form of your gathering stat. Like the other two, gathering does correspond to your catch chance. However, unlike the others, it is less of a percentage and more of a threshold, meaning if you want to catch X fish, you must first your gathering stat to X threshold, at which point you'll be able to catch the fish. But if you go beyond said threshold, it isn't going to improve your chances of catching that fish, and there will always be a chance they can get away. Perception works in a very similar manner, with there being a threshold that needs to be met in order to have a better chance of catching larger fish, which mostly serves for mooching or to build angler arts, a resource that can be used to restore GP, which is the only stat that remains the same, being used to execute your various abilities. Speaking of which, Fisher's abilities primarily focus on increasing yields, reducing catch time, preventing the same catch, restoring GP, and increasing the chances of larger fish. But two abilities I want to talk about specifically are Patience and Mooching. Starting with Patience, upon using this ability, you'll gain a buff that increases your chance of catching larger fish, but you'll also receive a massive penalty to catch chance when you use your normal hook. To avoid this penalty, you instead have to use your powerful or precision hook sets. However, the catch with these abilities is that they only get rid of the penalty if used on the correct fish size. Now, how you generally tell this is by looking at the exclamation marks when a fish bites. Generally, when a fish only has one, then you'll want to use precision, while if it has two, you'll want to use powerful. When it comes to three, generally powerful will work as well, but this can very much vary depending on the fish. Moving on to mooching, occasionally you'll catch a larger fish that you can use your mooch ability on. This won't actually change your bait to that fish, enabling you to catch other things that you may not be able to do with normal baits. And that's basically everything you need to know about Fisher as a new player in ARR. However, as I said earlier, it is by far the most complex of the gatherers, to the point that it could have its own video entirely. And there is much more to the job than what I went over, like spearfishing, ocean fishing, times, weather, etc. So if you do want to dive into the abyss that is fishing, there will be a variety of different resources in the description, including a 200-page guide by someone much more knowledgeable about the subject than me. Moving on to our second discipline, we have the crafters, and though there are 8 of them, they are mostly uniform, meaning if you learn one, you essentially learn them all. Starting with the crafting log, this is where you'll find all the different recipes that you're able to craft, along with the required stats and necessary items for said crafts. Speaking of necessary items, they come in 2 forms, that being normal and high quality, which will actually increase an item's starting quality, something which we'll touch upon later. Now, when you're ready to actually start a craft, you first have to hit the synthesize button, which will open a separate interface for crafting said item. Now, there are 5 things in this interface you need to know. Starting with the most important, we have the progress bar, which shows you how close you are to actually completing any given craft. The moment that this bar is filled by your progress abilities, the craft will be finished and you'll receive the item. Furthermore, the stat that corresponds to your progress bar is your craftsmanship, meaning the higher that stat, the more your progress abilities will fill the bar. The next important element is the durability, which tells you how many actions you can take before a craft ends. And if the progress bar isn't filled out by the time your durability runs out, then the craft will fail and you will not receive the item, and you may even lose your materials. Now, there is no stat that corresponds to durability. Instead, it's based on the item you're crafting, with materials hovering around 40, while other things range from 60 to 80. After durability, we have the quality bar, which tells you the chance that an item has of being high quality when the craft finishes, with it maxing out at 100% if filled completely. Like progress, you can fill this bar by using different abilities tied to said quality, and the amount that these abilities increase it by is determined by your second crafting stat, control. And as mentioned before, if high quality materials are used for the craft, then the item will start with the bar partially filled. Also, high quality items generally have more stats than the normal version, which is why they're more valuable. Moving on to the fourth element, we have condition. Now, what this does is give your control abilities a modifier depending on what condition is currently active, along with enabling some abilities like tricks of the trade. Normal, being the default, has no special modifiers. Good is the more common of the special modifiers and increases your quality abilities by 1.5 times. Excellent is the more rare of the special modifiers and it increases your quality abilities by 4 times. Poor always follows the excellent condition and is the only negative modifier, decreasing your quality abilities by half. And our last notable element is calculations, which once you click will open yet another interface showing you exactly how much progress or quality your abilities will produce at any given moment. Now, while it isn't a part of the crafting UI, I do want to quickly make a note of the final stat that we have yet to mention, CP, which, like GP, allows you to execute the various abilities, but unlike GP, it will reset every time you start a new craft. With the stats and interface covered, let's move on to the core crafting loop. Anytime you begin a craft, your first goal is always going to be to fill the progress bar as much as you can without actually finishing the craft. We do this to ensure that we will always complete the item, as all we need to do is use one last progress ability on the last durability. Now, after we get the progress to the point where one ability will finish the craft, our next goal is to build as much quality as possible. And that is the core crafting loop that will help you finish your items and make them high quality. But with that being said, there are obviously things that help enable the loop, starting with Inner Quiet. This is a passive boost to any of your quality abilities that can stack up to 10 times, and it gains a stack each time you use a quality ability. Later on, you'll even gain access to Burgot's Blessing, which increases its power for every stack of Inner Quiet you have when it's used. And once you get this ability, it will normally serve as your quality finisher, as it easily can fill a majority of the quality bar, and it consumes all your Inner Quiet stacks. The next set of important abilities comes in the form of our durability extenders. Abilities like Master Mend will restore durability, and Waste Not will cut durability costs in half for 4 actions. And why these are useful is because increasing your durability, it means you can use more actions before a craft is completed, thus giving you more time to build progress or build quality. And lastly, for the early game, we have buffing skills like Veneration and Innovation, which are abilities that will increase your progress or quality abilities by 50% for 4 actions, again, making it easier to get your perfect craft. I should also make quick note of Great Strides, which increases your next quality ability by 100%. This is almost exclusively used for Burgot's Blessing for a massive quality increase. With the basics covered, let's do a few crafts to help walk you through the process. Beginning with a very early game craft, let's show the basic loop. As mentioned earlier, we're going to begin by building our progress bar to the point that one more synthesis will finish the craft, after which we'll move on to our quality phase where we use our touch abilities to fill the quality bar. However, when our durability reaches 30, we'll use our only extender at this level to restore some durability, allowing more options and thus enabling us to create a high quality item with 10 durability to spare. Moving on up some levels, we have a slightly more involved craft thanks to the different abilities we can now use, such as Veneration, which we'll actually begin with to buff our progress gain, and we'll then follow it up with Waste Not, allowing us more actions. After that, we then repeat our crafting cycle, building as much progress as we can before we enter our quality phase. In the case of this craft, our progress phase is only 2 synthesis that we then follow up with our progress phase using 2 touches before our Waste Not falls off, at which point we use our other buff, Innovation, to increase our quality generation. And then we just continue to use our touch skills until we reach 100% or 10 durability, where we will finish the craft with our final synthesis. Now, even though this craft has a good few more abilities available than the first one, the core idea is still the same, and this is going to remain true as you get into the higher levels. Now, before we end off, I do want to show at least one more example, mostly to show the power of Burgot's Blessing. So this craft starts off much the same as the previous one, except I do skip the Veneration, as with my current gear, it would actually buff my progress gain too much, so I just go straight into Waste Not to start building my progress. However, after the first synthesis, our condition changes to good, so to take advantage of this, I do briefly switch to our touch skills as to not lose out on that extra quality that the condition provides. And I should have done that with the second good as well, but I missed it as I rushed my next synthesis, so you do want to be careful not to get ahead of yourself. But either way, we now enter our quality phase using Innovation as our Waste Not falls off. Now, normally we would have to continue this phase until about 10 or 20 durability, but with Burgot's Blessing, we can actually end it very early. With our Innovation now at 2 stacks, we can use Great Strides, which allows us to use a super buffed Burgot's Blessing, which is able to fill up roughly half of the quality bar. Now, do keep in mind that Burgot's Blessing should always be the last ability in your quality phase, as not only does it get stronger with the more Inner Quiet stacks you have, but it also removes them, thus making all your other quality abilities weaker. And that is everything you need to know about crafting and gathering as a new player, meaning we're nearing the end. Now, this video is the third in a series going over various things in Final Fantasy XIV to hopefully help new players on their journey. The next edition will be going over common mistakes new players make, and if it's already been released, you'll be seeing a link to said video shortly. If you found this video helpful, please consider liking it and possibly subscribing to the channel so you know when I release a new video. And feel free to ask any questions you may have in the comments, and I'll do my best to try and answer them. But with all that being said, thanks for watching, and I wish you the best on your Final Fantasy XIV journey.